All right. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that video. And, Dan Gilbert is one of the founding members of the positive movement. And he's also really well known for these sort of cognitive kinds of studies, right? Like, how do people think as a function of this? And he explained that, in reality, a year later, the $10 million lottery winner is no happier than they were the day that they won the day before they won the lottery. The person who has become a paraplegic is no less happy after a year than they were the day before the accident. We think these things are going to impact us more than they really are going to impact us. We think that something will make us happy. Something will make us unhappy. And in fact, happiness is a very stable quality. Okay, how about this thought exercise? Above what temperature would you consider the weather uncomfortably hot? How hot does it need to be outside for you to say, okay, that's it, I'm staying inside in the air conditioning, or I've got to go to the lake because I don't have any air conditioning and it's just too hot for me to cope? Or, I can't believe I have to go to work in this kind of heat, or whatever you're thinking, right? So how hot would it have to be for you to be thinking those thoughts? How cold would it have to be for you to say it's too cold? It's uncomfortably cold. How cold would it have to be? I think I'm better with the hot side, honestly. I'm like, yeah. Well, and it depends on where I live. If it's a very humid place, I can't take as much temperature increase as I can when it's a dry place. I think that's true for cold also. Cold, I guess I also have a problem with if it's cold enough and it's made it icy and slippery. I'm like, okay, well, but is that a discomfort that I don't feel like slipping? Does that count? Or are you just talking about what's happening by body? So I think too hard when they ask me these questions. So hopefully, in case you're thinking too hard, you realize I relate. But try to think, what would be the max that you would say it's gotten too hot? And what would be the minimum where you say it's gotten too cold? Okay, hopefully you have an answer. All right. And then think about, where have you spent the most time in your life? Your biggest block of time. Where did you live? Okay, so why would I be asking this? I'll bet you have some idea, right? Now that I've asked where you live. Because you sort of get used to whatever you've been living, right? I spent a brief period of time living on the west coast of Florida, so on the Gulf Coast, right about in the middle, just south of Tampa is where I lived. And I had never in my life experienced such humidity as I experienced there. I mean, it was humid. It never really cooled off in the evenings. It just was like a warm, moist blanket. And I moved there in December. So it's like I got there during what should have been the coolest period of the year. And I never had to put on a sweater. I lived there through the summer. I left in probably late July, maybe early August. So I kind of hit just the worst part of the summer, I think. And it was hot, sweaty all the time, even in January. And so, but I came from a dry place. I came from a relatively dry place. And so for me, that humidity was like, oh, I can't even. Right. And it's like I wasn't used to it. But the people who lived there, I couldn't understand how they could cope, but they were used to it. Being used to it is a big thing, right? Being used to I've got, for example, I'm living in a very dry place now, and it took me a little while to adjust to how dry it is. I haven't ever lived any place as dry as where I am now. And it took me a little while. Like, I finally have kind of gotten used to how much water I have to drink and other kinds of things just to hydrate myself. You get used to it, right? You adapt. It's what we call the adaptation level phenomenon, right? That you can get used to kind of anything. I'm trying to think of anything that wouldn't be subject to the adaptation level phenomenon. I can't think of anything and it could be pros and cons. It could be negative things. It could be positive things. You get used to it, and it loses its pro and it loses its con. It just becomes status quo. It becomes the baseline. So what we mean by the adaptation level phenomenon is that we have a tendency to adapt to a given level of stimulation, whether that stimulation is heat or that stimulation is cold or it's humidity or it's dryness. I mean, and these are very physical examples. You can imagine this is true for psychological things like happiness, right? That we get used to a certain level of stimulation. And what we notice and what we react to is anytime there's a change from that level. So that level becomes the baseline. And we only really sort of react or notice when it's substantially warmer than that or substantially colder than that or whatever. So think about that in terms of happiness. Okay, so let's say that there are upward changes in life circumstances. Let's say, for example, you graduate with your degree and immediately after graduation, you are offered a really good job in your field, like the thing that you wanted to be doing. And you start, next week. Yay, I have a good, stable job with an income and, a 401k and healthcare. And like, I have completely landed on my feet. This is awesome. I no longer am a student who can't afford anything and is eating top ramen all the time. Now I'm going to be a professional. Yay. It's going to make you happy, and obviously, deservedly so. But upward change in your life circumstances, that should make you happy. You're going to notice that change from the level. But then you adapt. And now that level becomes no longer upward changes in my life circumstances. This now just becomes my life circumstances. And so we need something better now to increase our happiness. And this helps to explain why people change jobs. You were so happy with it when you first got it, right? And then now that you're there, you're like, I've gotten used to this. I'm starting to notice some negatives about it. I think it's time for another upward change in my life circumstances. I'm going to look for another job. We need something better to increase our happiness briefly. And I say briefly because you will get used to it again. You'll adapt and this will become status quo, and then you'll need something to change in order for you to notice anything. So that's what we call the adaptation level phenomenon, where you get used to that. Adaptation there is what we're talking about, right? You get used to it. So now it becomes the standard and you need a change in order for you to feel like something has happened. All right, keeping that in mind, we're going to do another little thought exercise. Okay, so your first experience here is assume that you have been given information about the distribution of final grades in a course you've just completed. Back in the olden days when I was an undergraduate, you would find out what grade you got in a class by going into the hallway where your professor's office was, and they would have taped to the wall a roster of everyone's names and the letter grade they got. That's how we used to find out our grades. All right, we're not doing that in this demonstration. I just wanted you to appreciate how the positive change in educational practices is the status quo for you now, right? You're like, what? They used to put your names in public with your grade next to it? Yep, that's how we used to live. But now the status quo is no, everything's private. Oh my gosh. Okay. So in your class, the teacher didn't tell you how individual people did, but the teacher said, these are the grades I gave. And so you see that there were 40 A's given and 50 B's and 10 C's, and there were no D's or F's. All right. So how on this rating scale from 0 to 100%, if this was your class, right? Let's say that this happened in a class that you just took. How satisfied would you be with your grade if your grade was an A? Given this distribution, how satisfied with an A would you be? What if you got a B plus in this class? How satisfied would you be? What if you got a B in this class? How satisfied would you be? What if you got a C plus in this class? What if you got a C? So for each of those grades, imagine yourself in this circumstance. and think, how happy would I be if I was in this class and I got an A? What if I got one of those 10 C's? What if I knew that I got one of those 10 C's, but I was like a C plus? So I was like on the top of the C's, or a B or a B plus. So I like the majority of people got B's, but at least I was a B plus. I was on the top part of those students. Like, how satisfied would you be with those grades? All right. So I want you to have thought about that, saw that narrow distribution. We're going to do the exact same thought exercise, but now look at the distribution of grades the teacher gave. So we've got 10 A's, 30 B's, 40 C's, 15 D's, and 5 F's. So this looks a lot more like a normal distribution. It's a lot closer, at least, to the normal distribution. And now, again, you're going to rate how happy you would be if you were to get any of these grades. So now the exact same grades, A, B plus, B, C plus, C, in the context of this distribution, would it affect your satisfaction? Would you be more satisfied getting an A in this context when only 10 A's were given out versus this situation where 40 A's were given out? Which one would make you happier? Would you be happier with a B or a B plus when 30 were given, or when, 50 B's were given in the last one? How do you feel about that C or C plus when you see that the bulk of people who got any individual grade was C? Like, that's the biggest, most common grade. So would you be more satisfied with a C in this distribution than you would be in the distribution where there weren't very many C's and it was the lowest grade anybody got? Like, wouldn't you be more satisfied in this context? Especially when you know there are D's and F's, right? So probably all of the grades are more meaningful in this distribution, honestly. Like, you'd probably be happier with all of these grades in this distribution when you see that there's worse places you could be, right? Or that you're very elite, really, honestly, if you got an A, right? Because only 10 people got an A. If you're in that category, you should be like, wow, I really kicked it. This is good. The B is not as outstanding as it once had been, but at least it's like, again, kind of elevated compared to a lot of people in class. So maybe the B and the B plus are like a better feeling right now when you know you did better than the vast majority of people, and that there was all spectrums of grades. And maybe the C is more relief than happy, right? So maybe you're not as satisfied as you would be with an A or a B, but at least you're relieved that you're not in the D or the F, right? So probably this distribution benefits all of the grades as far as satisfaction. So having a better distribution probably is better. It's funny because students don't really like seeing a distribution like this because they don't like seeing the D's and F's, and especially if their grade is in it. Obviously, they don't like seeing that. But in the big scheme of things, a distribution like this honestly feels better than a distribution like this where most people got A's and B's. It's, not as satisfying to get an A when most people got an A, right? Well, I guess most people got a B, but I mean, it doesn't feel as good getting that A when it's not as hard fought. It's not as good of a representation of your skill. It might be a representation of how easy grader the teacher is, or how easy the content was, or something like that. So this kind of distribution, while it does feel kind of a little bit harsher, might produce greater satisfaction for at least the A, B, and C students than the narrow distribution might have made you feel. Well, hopefully you played along with me and you know what I'm talking about with that. Let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back and talk about some variations in happiness.